Good afternoon. My name is Jess Sweeney, and I'm happy to welcome all of you today on behalf of the Collegium Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture, which serves the University of Pennsylvania, and Dappled Things, a quarterly of ideas, art, and faith. I'd like to take a moment as well to thank all of our wonderful co-sponsors for this event who helped us spread the word. Those co-sponsors are Image Journal, Catholic University of America Press, St. Gregory's Hall in Chicago, the Lumen Christi Institute, Durham University's Center for Catholic Studies, the University of St. Thomas's MFA in Creative Writing, and Wellspring, a Mother Artist Project. As I said, my name is Jess Sweeney, and I'm the director of Collegium's Ars Vivendi Arts Initiative, which aims to create a conversational space to explore the relationship between beauty, faith, and the arts, probing their importance to human culture and to a life well lived. The initiative seeks to integrate artistic craft and practice with an understanding of the intellectual life behind the creative mind, exploring questions like what is beauty, why do we have an impulse to make, and where do art and faith meet? Today, we will be joined by Bonnie Lander-Johnson and Julia Meszaros, editors of Catholic University of America's new series, Catholic Women Writers, and by Dappled Things editor-in-chief, Katy Carl, as moderator of today's conversation. We will investigate the need to recover these female voices and look at how they contribute to the Catholic imagination and what the tradition is gaining with their voices entering back in. These lost stories and women are needed to make the body whole again. And so with that, I will pass it off to Katy Carl, who will introduce our speakers and get our conversation going.
Thank you, Jess. Everybody, along with Jess, I would like to welcome you to our conversation today and thank you for being here. As she said, I will quickly introduce Bonnie and Julia and then let them tell us about the series and about the novels and the writers of those novels. Bonnie Lander-Johnson earned her DPhil at Oxford and is Fellow and Director of Studies at Newnham College, Cambridge University. She teaches English literature from all historical periods, but writes mainly on Shakespeare and the Renaissance, with a focus on the history of science and religion. She's the author of Chastity in Early Stuart Literature and Culture, Cambridge 2015, and the editor of Blood Matters and the Cambridge Handbook of Literature and Plants. Julia Meszaros holds a DPhil in Theology and Literature from Oxford, spent 4 years as a postdoctoral researcher at KU Leuven, and now lectures at St. Patrick's College in Maynooth. She's the author of Selfless Love and Human Flourishing in Paul Tillich and Iris Murdoch, and the editor of Sacrifice and Modern Thought. And together, these two writers and thinkers edit the Catholic Women Writers series from Seaway Press and write about the Catholic literary revival in the 19th and 20th centuries, and particularly about the women who contributed to that movement. So Bonnie, if you want to take it away.
Thanks, Jess. Hi, everyone. It's great to be given this opportunity to talk about our women writers. Julia and I were doctoral students together at Oxford a long time ago. She was working on literature in the theology department, and I was working on theology in the literature department. And we used to spend a lot of time talking about our love of literature, especially those novels that offered a vision of Catholic life that was lived in the world and in our world, our contemporary world. At the time, I think we assumed, like many readers, that the list of such novels was quite short. Obviously, the work by Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene are the immediate examples that come to mind, and those were the books that we loved. So then we finished our PhDs and we went off to get jobs in different countries and to start our families. But we always made sure that we had time to meet up and to talk about the novels that we were reading. And then this shared interest turned into a research project. We were convinced that there must surely be, a lot more of the kinds of novels that we liked to read. So we did a bit of digging and were surprised to find not only that there are, in fact, dozens and dozens of really great Catholic novels written in the 19th and 20th centuries that had fallen out of print. But we also found that many of those novels were written by women who had completely disappeared from the historical record. So we started this multi-volume series of novels with Catholic University of America Press. We're bringing out 2 paperbacks each year, and these are novels from around the end of the 19th century and right through the 20th century. So we're currently working on a 1987 novel about the Troubles in Northern Ireland. So we do go, as close up to 2000 as we can. The volumes contain an introduction that's written in an accessible style, but grounded in scholarship. So they're comparable in tone to an Oxford Classics edition, but providing, that thing that was always missing for me from an Oxford Classics, which is an attention in the introduction, not just to the historical and literary qualities of the text, but also to its theological concerns. Certainly in my field, the theological concerns of a novel tend to be one of the last things that are considered when we get these introductions to what are considered the greats. So many of the novels in fact, did use and develop some of the most current and innovative techniques of their time, the literary techniques, but they did so in specifically theological ways. To give you an example, Caryll Houselander's novel uses narrative techniques that were emerging in the 1930s, so really, really up-to-date techniques, but she uses them in order to produce a specifically Catholic vision. And this is actually very clever, very difficult, but very clever of her, given that the techniques that she's using were being developed by novelists in the 1930s who were seeking to depict, they wanted to write realist novels about a world that was actually devoid of divine presence. And they were developing these new realist methods specifically to unpick the kind of providential vision of the 19th century bourgeois Protestant novel. So then Houselander comes along and takes what are essentially atheist techniques and uses them to depict a specifically Catholic vision in which divine action is at work in the world all the time. So these are novels that require of literary critics a theological ear, but they also require that theologians have an eye for literary technique. I'm going to give you an example now of just how lost or forgotten some of these women had become. One of our favorite writers, Josephine Ward, belonged to the first generation of modern Catholics who were living in Britain just after the Catholic hierarchy was reestablished after centuries of persecution. So this was a very small community, just kind of beginning to very slowly arrive back into public life, very nervously arriving back into public life. And she was very active in the development of a theologically and culturally literate laity. She was very concerned to help her fellow Catholics be educated. She lived into the 1930s, but she was born in the 19th century. So really she was a Victorian woman. She was very good friends with Newman, who often came to her house to talk with her and her biographer husband about all the issues of the day and about what they were writing about. Newman also came to catechize her children, but she was also very good friends with the Tennysons. So she was a central figure in Catholic circles as well as the literary world. She had 5 children. She did some quite remarkable things in public life that a Victorian woman didn't usually do, like giving lectures and traveling to give lectures and running debates in very prominent areas of public life in which people from all walks of life were invited, including high-ranking politicians, to just talk about the main issues of the day. So she wrote 10 very, very fine novels. All of them were very well received by the literary establishment, even though they were explicitly Catholic novels. And then her daughter, Maisie Ward, went on to establish the Catholic publishing house Sheed and Ward with offices in London and New York. But for all of this prodigious activity, she has almost entirely fallen from the historical record. Until our series, her novels had been out of print, and she didn't have any entries in any of the national encyclopedias of biography that we would normally expect for a person of that status. She now has one in the ODNB because we've written it for her, but that's the level of sort of cultural amnesia that we're talking about with some of these women. So by recovering these lost women from the Catholic literary revival, I think we actually find that our understanding of the Catholic novel changes quite a bit. Many novels by Catholic women are, in a theological and a literary sense, actually quite different from those of War and Green. Novels by War and Green tend to focus on the solitary figure of a priest or a layman in spiritual battle with the world around him. Whereas novels by Catholic women are often situated in families and in villages and in the institutional communities in which the writers themselves first encountered the faith. Schools, convents, and convent schools, almost wholly unrecognized by scholarship of the Catholic novel, or indeed of the novel generally, are the frequent depictions of female religious life in novels of the 20th century. So it does remain strange that these women have fallen out of print. Less strange, I think, is the fact that they were the revival's earliest and most prodigious writers. The novel was always a primarily feminine or feminized genre. There's, of course, loads of wonderful male novelists, but it does remain true that from its earliest emergence in the 18th century, the novel was a genre written overwhelmingly by women, and one that frequently explored the internal lives of female characters and their negotiation of personal relationships within the more limited geographical setting of a single house or village or city. And the novel is also a genre that's very well suited to the exploration of social and political change. So unlike most pre-modern literary forms, the novel can provide a voice for those who do not possess great social power, who must navigate moral challenges, often on their own and in direct conflict with the culture around them, and who, in doing so, offer criticisms of their society. And in this respect, I think the novel actually offered a perfect vehicle for exploring the challenges faced by a Catholic in the modern world, and perhaps we might say by a female Catholic in the modern world. So I'm going to stop talking now and hand over to Julia.
Hi, thanks so much for having us and letting us speak about our series here. So before I offer some theological thoughts on the novels by these women, because obviously my background is the more theological one, where Bonnie's is the more literary one, I want to be clear that we're not dealing with theological novels as such. And if we were, that would be probably quite tedious. But instead, the novels by the women of the literary revival are instead novels about a broad range of themes, including hierarchy and class structures, changing social mores, education, the human person's relationship with the land, urban, rural kind of comparisons, and of course, love, inevitably. And so these novels are entertaining and thought-provoking, and they are all that for male and female readers alike. So they are, though written by women, by no means written only for women. And really, we are very convinced that they will be highly interesting and engaging to male readers as well, obviously, like any good novel would be. But what does give them added interest is that they explore these themes that much of literature does explore through a specifically Catholic lens. And they thereby illumine what it means to live in this world with all its challenges as a Catholic. And this is the kind of thing Bonnie and I were hungry for when we first started sifting through Catholic literature, and of which we're finding so much more among the 20th century writers, Catholic writers, and especially women writers, than we once maybe thought. So when these women seek to render life's varied realms and challenges in their art, they do so by invoking the teachings of the Church, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly, as well as the Church's different forms of spirituality. And they all engage in deep theological thinking in the process. This shouldn't really come as a surprise, because most of these women were highly educated and often wrote not only fiction, but had really broad and varied intellectual lives. Like Bonnie said, Josephine Ward, for example, lectured on a range of theological topics throughout her life and was engaged with the Catholic Truth Society and so on. And even when they weren't as highly educated, they were sharp and curious, and importantly, brought to their art a wisdom they derived from living in the world. So all of these women were deeply active in their local communities as mothers, nuns, counselors, farmers, founders of religious communities, and so on. So they were women of great faith, as well as of great initiative and versatility and intellectual depth. And so one of the goals of our series is to unearth the religious and theological implications contained in their work. And this is what we do in our introductions to those novels that come at the front, that are sort of the front matter of each book. And to thereby make those theological implications available and meaningful also to readers who might not be as attuned to that kind of a layer of a work of fiction. So in fact, there are some, just to kind of explain how this is so relevant, there are some women of the Catholic revival, such as Antonia White or Kate O'Brien, who haven't been forgotten and whose works do continue to be in print and always were in print. But the religious dimension of whose work has been completely overlooked. Like Bonnie said, that's often the last thing literary critics will look at. And this to the point that interpretations of their work are oftentimes entirely skewed. And so we're currently, I should say, not putting into print women whose writings are or have continued to be in print. But this is just to underline the importance of bringing to the fore a novel's Catholic frame in order to do it true justice. So what are the theological themes of these novels? They are, in a sense, the ancient and timeless theological themes that Christians have grappled with from the beginning. They include the drama of redemption and salvation, the nature of religious faith in general, the relation between human and divine love, the role of conscience, the reality of divine grace, the importance of doctrine and of the sacraments, and so on. And it's actually interesting to see that a lot of the women we've been looking at don't shy away even from the most difficult and tricky aspects of the faith, such as the reality of miracles, the role of indulgences, Catholic sexual morality, the efficacy of prayers for the dead, that kind of thing. So they're really unafraid, and yet they address those things in a very nuanced and intelligent and considered way. So as you can see already, the women of the revival that we're looking at continue the classical Christian tradition, and they engage with this, as any good writer would, from their distinctive vantage point, and that is obviously a modern one. So in effect, their work illustrates for us the meaning and relevance of the Catholic faith and its teachings to our modern lives. In subtle and very different, sometimes more, sometimes less explicit ways, they give expression to the faith as lived in the modern world, how it allows us to navigate that world and its challenges, but also what challenges that faith might at times pose to modern men and women. For instance, in regards to the need to discriminate between what to let go of and what to hold on to. And we can look at that more later on, but this is a subject that Sheila Kaye-Smith deals with, where to draw moral lines, such in Josephine Ward's treatment of marriage and divorce. Even indirectly, the question of euthanasia is present in Houselander's novel, The Drywood, how to school our children in a world that is largely antithetical to Catholic faith, and so on. Now, while these women really vary quite a lot one from the other, and each have their distinctive interests and concerns, we are finding also some shared patterns among them. And perhaps it's because these women had, maybe more than some of their male counterparts, such practical as well as intellectual lives, that their writing is incredibly sensitive, humane, balanced, and above all, sacramental. These are attributes that I think we can fairly say apply to all of these women in a very distinctive and particular way. Now, what do I mean by that? By calling their writing sacramental, for example? It appears that what all of them have in common is an intense drive to seek divine grace in ordinary human lives, dilemmas, and in particular, perhaps in human suffering. So in different ways, they're all very attuned to the difficulties of human existence, and they meet these with great charity. They're equally intent, each of them, on locating and capturing the workings of divine grace in precisely those difficulties. So instead of being either despairing of the modern world and its challenges, or idealistically pursuing some kind of, pure Catholic ideal, they really confront the modern world with its challenges head on, and insist on finding God at work in it. And that's a beautiful thing, I think. So Houselander's novel, The Drywood, for instance, is a really moving exploration of, and in fact, a display of the meaning of innocent suffering. That novel centers on a 7-year-old disabled child whose death seems imminent. And without in any way diminishing the pain of that situation, and in fact of many other forms of affliction surrounding this particular situation, Houselander manages to quietly and persuasively convey the presence of Christ and the work of his divine grace in that suffering of that child. And that's a very tricky and challenging thing to do. In fact, it's something that would be very difficult to do conceptually, that we as theologians would struggle to achieve in theoretical terms, which is why a lot of theologians since the Second World War have actually sort of skirted the issue of suffering, but something that Houselander does really well through the means of fiction. Sheila Kaye-Smith's The End of the House of Allard and Josephine Ward's One Poor Scruple similarly explore immensely difficult situations of false loyalties, unfulfilled love, worldly shame, and the like, but all the while pursue and find the redemptive potential of these very challenges. And so in these ways, their works are also deeply incarnational. Christ is present in the poverty of the dark and cold stable, and so love is present, or at least can be present, in human suffering as well. So you see the kind of direct inspiration they constantly draw from the life of Christ himself. Now, this is, of course, no theological innovation, but it is an emphasis especially typical of and perhaps also especially relevant to modernity. And something that the women of the revival, and in different ways the men as well, were not actually particularly intent on drawing a constant separation or boundary here, but just the women we've been dealing with do so very well. And in keeping with this incarnational emphasis, grace in these works is often mediated through the material realities of human life, such as the baking of bread in Mary Beckett's novel, Give Them Stones, something as banal, seemingly banal, as the repair of cars, which features in Kaye-Smith's novel, or the physical care for a disabled child, such as that very sickly boy. All of these very material, everyday tasks have in these books sacramental power. Now, I'll say one last thing, and that is that despite this very practical embodied emphasis, a lot of these works also have a very marked regard for doctrine, for the teachings of the church. So they're intellectually dense and challenging and self-consciously founded on the teachings of the church as a vehicle of grace that helps a person withstand temptation. And they view doctrine as something that allows a person to seek and recognize grace through the concrete materials of our everyday existence. And perhaps I'll come back to that later and we can look at that in more detail. But for now, I'll leave it at that and hand back over to Katy.
Hi, thank you, Bonnie, and thank you, Julia. Before we jump into the Q&A part of our conversation, I'd just like to remind everyone attending that you can use the Q&A function. It's the two chat bubbles right down next to the chat. The chat is closed, but the Q&A is open, and you can drop all of your questions for us there. Due to time constraints, we won't be able to get to everyone, but we are eager to hear your thoughts. So thank you again. And to kind of place these Catholic women writers within the broader context of women's writing at the time, I looked at Virginia Woolf's essay, Women in Fiction, which she put out in 1929, the same year as A Room of One's Own. And in that essay, Woolf characterizes women writers up to her day as having been constrained or restrained by their domestic position. And she identifies the changes in social role for women as also driving or accompanying a change in the way that they employ the art of fiction. From an emphasis on the personal and emotional toward the social and cultural, the political, and for Woolf, she calls it the poetic. And I think for us, she identifies that as, you know, our destiny and the meaning of life. That's a direct quote from the essay. For us, I think we would also tend to emphasize the metaphysical and religious concerns that maybe for Woolf are more backgrounded. What I'm hearing in these characterizations of the Catholic women of the literary revival is that they were, you know, if they were in any sense constrained by their social position, they were, that constraint for them was generative, and that they were able to, they were particularly well positioned to speak to changing themes in modernity and to the deeper and more enduring themes of human life that continue to be relevant throughout modernity, precisely because of their framework of faith. And there's always a tendency, I think, with women writers to draw a closer relation between the life of the writer and the content of their work. But another thing that I am picking up is that with these writers, there is a very close relation between their life or biographical details, their literary projects, and the theological concerns that they bring to their work and that they explore through the art of fiction primarily. So can you, Bonnie or Julia, maybe give some examples of the way that you see this happening with a particular novelist?
Can I jump in?
Yeah, you go, buddy. You start.
So just to say thanks for bringing Woolf into the conversation. I'm at the same institution where she gave that talk, Women in Fiction, which turned into the famous book. In fact, she gave it in the room next door, we think. And I often think of her and silently do act, you know, I'm thankful that she wrote that book. The older I get, each time I look at it, I realize how much of it's actually about money. I think she's arguing that no one can write without a little bit of money, actually. So I'm very grateful to her for that, because we're all still struggling writers. But it's true that she set herself apart slightly in the way that she understood the meaning of women's lived experience in relation to their fiction. And it's really terrific. One of the great things I find in doing this work with Julia is being able to fill in the picture there, because as you say, Katy, I think a lot of our women had a very specific, I would say, embodied, lived understanding of their own life and the way that it fed fiction that was perhaps quite different from Woolf's. Woolf was really an intellectual of a very precise kind, whereas a lot of our women actually thought of themselves as ordinary women. Obviously, I talked about Josephine Ward earlier. She wasn't an ordinary woman. In fact, I mean, she was an aristocrat, you know, hands down. We have to say she was a woman of means. But a lot of the other women were very consciously promoting or not promoting themselves because they thought of themselves as ordinary. And going about the ordinary work of living life, having children, providing for people, often doing quite difficult practical work like founding a parish in the middle of Sussex where there wasn't one for miles, and then overseeing the work of a busy rural parish while also writing on the side. So they were often, it wasn't like writing was this kind of hallowed, illuminating activity that they were dedicating their lives to. They were certainly prodigious in their output, but it was always on the side of a fuller life. And in fact, one example, Sheila Kaye-Smith, is really interesting because she was not a Catholic. I mean, a lot of these women were converts. We should say that too. A lot of them were already writing before they converted. So we actually see a change in their literary corpus and in their biography at that point. And while for most of them, conversion actually was generative of more literature and richer literature, with Kaye-Smith, Sheila Kaye-Smith, she was already a very well-established bestseller she was known for this Sussex rural novel. She'd written dozens of these things. And then she converted, and she wrote one really very fine Catholic novel, which is in our series. It's already out. It's called The End of the House of Allard. And then, strangely, she didn't write another novel. She wrote books on the saints and some other kind of spiritual pieces of spiritual autobiography. But it was almost as though she had in conversion, she had realized the fullness of her life, stopped being so kind of obsessive about her writing career, and instead saw that there was other work to be done, which was valuable, just as, if not, more than the writing. And so she founded this parish and did all of these other things. And that's it. That's one example. She's the only one who stopped writing after conversion. But certainly a lot of women of our writers suffered to inordinate degrees. Child loss seems to be a regular theme, or loss of a spouse, or mental breakdown, really quite difficult periods of their life. And that's, all writers tend to turn to writing as a way of dealing with suffering. But what we find with these novelists is the process by which they're making art out of their suffering is always filtered through their knowledge of doctrine. So they are working through their characters' suffering in a theological way. And that's something unique to this corpus of work. And Julia can talk more about that. But often, as she said, when Julia was speaking, one of the unique things of fiction over argumentation, for instance, is that it can be so nuanced and careful, and I would say actually quite loving, in putting forward and exploring questions that are really difficult. So the question of innocent suffering that Julia mentioned. Also, right now, we're dealing with this quite difficult topic in our Troubles novel about poverty, and the question of, how to hold together the need to remove people's suffering, to get people out of unjust poverty, while also maintaining an awareness that there's something that might be a good there, when the alternative is not necessarily comfort brings other problems with it, and that's a really difficult case to make in an argument. But in a work of fiction, we get to see it playing out in a whole set of different lives, and to see people observing the consequences of an event in another person's life and to process it in a personal, interior way. It's more subtle and careful. And so, that seems to be how the novels are dealing with suffering, at that sort of embodied personal level, but also with this hand on doctrine. Julia will have more to say about that.
Yeah, maybe just not to get stuck on your initial question, but it is a really interesting one that you and Wolf raise. And also to what you just said, Bonnie, I suppose the one thought I had there now was that I think the beauty of the faith, the Catholic faith, is that it always looks at life as a whole, and it gives one's life an overarching vision and goal that unites us with our fellow human beings, but that also allows us to integrate every aspect of our lives into this one goal, which is to participate in God's redemption and to, thereby save our souls and those of our fellow human beings, or just to receive divine grace, however you want to put it. But so, therefore, I think for the Catholic writer, though it is certain, I'm sure, true that with modernity and the changing social structures, there was a certain momentum there for women to come to the fore and to, get published and therefore to be able to write, and make a few pennies of it as well. Nonetheless, for the Catholic writer, that question of gender, just as the question of poverty and so on, doesn't arise in as sort of isolated and all or nothing kind of a way as it would for somebody like Woolf. So for these women, I think their womanhood and the roles that came with that were just part of their identity and their mission in life, and it fed into their writing in positive ways. It maybe sometimes posed a challenge, but they viewed themselves as, they were just so much. They like we said, they were mothers, they were artists, they were social workers, and it was all part of one larger vision. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Yeah, maybe we'll leave it at that.
And one salient feature of these women writers, from Caryll Houselander to Sheila Kaye-Smith to some of the less known figures who are going to be coming forward, the names of Alice Thomas Ellis and Caroline Gordon will be familiar to a lot of folks who follow the Catholic revival. But for example, the Irish writers who are focusing on the troubles, and some of these newer writers are not going to be as familiar. But in all of them, I think one salient feature is that they're so diverse. You have women who were mothers and women who weren't. You have women who are deeply involved in their parish structures. You have women who are deeply involved in education, as with Josephine Ward, and lecturing. There's this great diversity, but there's also this uniting factor in that they're all viewing experience and modernity through the lens of faith. I guess I wonder if we can posit that there's an integrating influence there, precisely in their shared Catholic belief that helps them to bring together these disparate roles that might be perceived as being in tension with artistic creation. If that was, I think I hear you saying, Julia, that was something that maybe eased the path for them, that integration, whereas, for Woolf, it would have been a dichotomy that I think that dichotomy has been handed down even to our moment. There's, sort of a spate of books coming out right now. The Baby on the Fire Escape. There's one due out tomorrow called How Not to Exclude Artist Mothers. This tension, I think, persists in the culture, and I think it continues to affect women writers in different ways. Not that the tension between family and community on the one hand and intellectual or artistic contribution on the other doesn't affect male writers. It certainly does, but it tends to affect them in different ways, in ways that are embodied obviously in different ways. And I think childbearing is one of the things, but not the only thing that, obviously not every writer in the series was, physically a mother, but, different expectations for what a woman's life would look like. I guess I wonder if there's a way to speak to the ways in which the Catholic framework might have actually been of assistance to these women in keeping their disparate roles in union with one another.
Yeah, one thing that springs to mind there is that Caryll Houselander, for example, she was attuned to the gender question insofar as, for example, she really opposed the separation of the sexes in all realms of Catholic life, which would have been common at the time, so that from a very young age on, the boys would be doing one activity in the parish and the girls another, and this would continue basically until marriage, at which point again then the women would join the, legionaries or whatever, and so on. And she wanted men and women to work together because she viewed them as having different contributions to make that would only come to their best and fullest fruition if they had that, if they collaborated like that, male and female, he created them, she said about that. At the same time, it's just not an issue that I think most genuine Catholic believers and artists would isolate, like I said, and go on about. So at the end of the day, what Houselander, and I think a lot of these women were struggling with the most, was simply the sheer amount of work that had to be done in this broken and fallen world. So it wasn't about her role as a woman and, the kind of barriers she would encounter as that. In fact, Houselander's focus was always, in all her spiritual writing and her novel, to look away from the self and the ego and one's own needs and desires and towards others. So it wasn't about her frustration so much as it was simply about just figuring out how to do everything that needed to be done. And her art for her was something that needed to be done because she viewed it and she knew it to be her vocation in life to, create beautiful works of art, whether it was her wood carvings or her writings or her drawings, all of that. So how to get that done in the in the midst of an environment in which she was surrounded by people. I mean, she lived through 2 world wars. She was surrounded by people who were deeply traumatized and suffering in all sorts of ways. And she knew that as a Catholic and she needed to actually minister to these people. And that was part of her, and especially as a lay woman, this was part of her vocation as well. And so she was incredibly overworked. She barely ate or slept because there was just in her mind so much to be done. And I'm only scratching the surface here. On the other hand, Josephine Ward, for example, interestingly, who lived, like Bonnie said, she was a Victorian woman. She lived mostly in the 19th century. She and her husband actually, now they probably did have household help, but nonetheless, she and her husband really split a lot of the work. And in fact, it was he who wrote in, surrounded by their 5 children, and it was he who was able to kind of multitask like that in a way that we would, I think, consider to be quite modern. So he wasn't this removed father. And it was she who needed peace and quiet in order to be able to get creative and focus, and who would, therefore at times have to remove herself from family life. And so I just think it's interesting and beautiful to see how, again, the faith actually allowed this Victorian family to circumvent social mores, the social mores of the time and the constraints, and to figure out a working life that suited them each as human beings, because that is ultimately the first criterion or category that we're obviously, that defines us, and them as artists or as writers. He was a biographer primarily and a lecturer. I don't know, Bonnie, if you want to.
Yeah, I think actually, I mean, as you say, Katie, each of these writers had very different lives and experiences and sort of household arrangements, which actually matters a lot because everyone was writing at home, right? I mean, no matter what decade we're in, people are writing under domestic conditions. It's one of those jobs that doesn't really involve going to the office, right? So actually for all of our women, and this goes for probably all writers, you need to look at the situation in which they're working, and the working conditions of our women in particular are really diverse and really interesting. Poor Houselander, she stayed up all night. I mean, I can't, when you look at how she lived her life in the last few years, it's extreme, but she had sort of she'd come to find a way of living that was it's like a mysticism for the artist. You could study her and see she'd actually managed to find something like the code of St. Benedict for artists who don't have families and who are also mystics, because she was a mystic too. So she had this extremely ascetic lifestyle, barely eating, barely sleeping. And at one point when she was helping to raise the baby of a good friend's daughter, she didn't have anywhere to sleep because she didn't want to disturb the baby. So she would sit in the bathroom, and this is a British bathroom, tiny little bathroom, all night in the cold with no heating, because she had to write back to all of the correspondence. On top of everything else, when someone wrote to her with their problems, she always wrote back. It was part of her vocation to be there for the people who asked her questions. So she had this quite insane life, really, but it obviously suited her. And then, we quite like to read about Josephine's ward life because she thinks they had it seems a bit of an idyll, because yes, they did have this nice house and they did have one person in the house helping them and someone in the garden, but they were very attentive to each other's needs. So that everybody got time to write, but also everybody got time with the children, because that was seen to be very important. It would have been, that was
their first mission in life, wasn't it?
It would have been perceived as a loss for them, not like a failure of role, but a personal loss to have not had time educating the children. And he felt this as much. But so the other thing, and then, of course, between those two, there's all sorts of different lives. Alice Thomas Ellis had 7 kids in this completely mad bohemian scruffy house in Camden, but she was also helping to run her husband's publishing house at the end of the road. So she'd be catering for some ridiculous literary party while writing on the kitchen table and stirring the soup and looking after children and editing some manuscript. And doing it all, in one kind of chaotic moment, but that seemed to be useful for her to snatch 10 minutes here and there to move a sentence around on the page and then go back to something else. And running, she hosted the most insane parties. I still occasionally meet people, elderly people who say, "Oh, I remember those parties. They were so wild." So she was there in this kind of bohemian Camden world, but well known to be a quite traditionalist Catholic. So, they're often these sort of very interesting figures. She was also an editor of the literary list in her husband's publishing house. Well, it wasn't his, it was their publishing house. And I like this bit about her because we tend to forget about it. She was very concerned to help young writers to develop their voice. And often young writers came to this particular publishing house, not because they made any money. They didn't at all. It failed in the end. They went bankrupt because the husband had no business nose at all. But they wanted to work with her because she was such a good editor. And she particularly wanted to help young women who didn't have any literary connections, because, even if this is in the 80s and 90s, even still, the London literary scene was quite elite. You had to know people. So she would meet young women, sometimes through her daughter at school or in the parish or out on the street or at readings, who had no connections at all, but had this really interesting voice. And they'd come to the house, they'd move in for weeks, and she'd work with them amongst the rest of the domestic hubbub on their voice. So she was sought after by younger women in that regard. It was another strong sense of mission, I think, that she felt actually that her art and her skill was a gift that needed to be shared. So I just want to also go back to the point that Katy raised about the faith actually being a point of connection and possibly even a sort of a moment of an enabling experience for them. I'd also like to highlight that perhaps what we're doing here is a comparable situation, but in the first half of the 20th century, it would have been called a literary coterie, and there were a lot of these in London. So people probably know Alice Meynell. She's sometimes been described as single-handedly establishing the literary Catholic revival simply through opening up her front room for salons. So one thing which we've lost from the historical record, but I think we can touch by reading the work of these writers, is that they did know each other and they were supportive of each other. So the fact of being Catholics did provide a certain community. They would meet at salons, they wrote letters to each other, they read each other's work, they helped to bring each other on. But I would also say too that publishing, there was a lot less written then than there is now. So not only were they reading each other and everything else that was being written, but I do think, and this is something that literary scholars have lost, non-Catholic writers and readers at the time were also reading them. Literary modernism still tends to be considered as a movement without belief, but it's just not true. There is a lot of modernist literature that's very concerned with metaphysical questions. And I do think that writers who are on the literary canon, modernist writers who are on the literary canon now, were probably reading Houselander and others. And they were, of course, better versed in questions of Christian doctrine than most people are now. So they could pick up a fair bit of what was being done. And so when our writers can, what we can see them doing is using most up-to-date literary strategies. And I think that shows them in conversation with their literary peers in a way that shows these techniques can also do this other thing. This is the current literary moment explored through the lens of this vision that I am active in, am exploring. It's not vision that we see, we're in it all the time. We're trying to understand it and work through the world of faith. But our writers were able to show a vision of their world even to non-Catholic writers, and I think they considered that also to be a very important part of their mission, to take what was new, because they respected writers. Houselander defended modernist writers. She said they're not the egoists that most people say they are. They're deeply engaged in big questions. It's just that they don't get, they don't have the gift of the doctrine that we do. But it is my vision, she said, it's my mission to take their gifts and add to them this other thing that I am exploring and that I can see, and to give the world back through that lens. So yeah, I'll stop.
No, that's wonderful. And that provides a really excellent moment to segue into our listener questions. There are a lot of really great things here. So I want to pick up on that and continue with this idea of these writers as speaking into their moment, speaking to their peers and being read by their peers. Helena Tomko asks, how relevant is a specifically English Catholic identity to these novels, in particular, whether the recusant past the time in which these Catholic writers would have been very much less able to to speak into their context. They've been limited for 300 years or more in the kinds of positions they can hold, the kind of property they can hold, the laws that they're subject to, and that's all just changed in this moment. How important is that to these writers and to the ways in which they're able or not able to speak to their peers? Helena goes on to say, my sense is of a shared imaginative habitat that lends itself to fruitful writing, but can you all speak to what that context might have looked like?
Can I just say something about Ward, Julia? Is that?
Yeah, I think Ward is probably the main person relevant to this, isn't she?
Yeah, the novel also just to say too, I'm sorry, we're naming all of these novels and novelists, and I'm conscious that people might be trying to write the titles down. There's perhaps we can share the link at the end. The press, there's a section on the press website that not only lists the books as they come out, but also has a paragraph with the lists of a lot of the writers that we will be looking at and which we're talking about today. So that might be a good place for people to go if they want to just check some of the books that we're referring to. So the Ward novel that is coming out very soon and is on the press website is called One Poor Scruple, and it's exactly engaged with this problem. It's written in 1899, so right on the cusp of the turn of the century, and it tells the story of two generations of one family. The older generation are still completely in the recusant past, and they have lived for centuries in this strange, hidden away, aristocratic, recusant life. No engagement at all really in public life. So they are landed gentry, but not holding any of the public offices that Protestant gentry would have been expected to hold. So they value the faith above everything, but also sort of sport. They're kind of, hardy, aristocratic, family, farming, landowning folk who are suspicious of modernity, deeply suspicious, kind of anti-intellectual, actually, but who have created this life as a way of surviving for hundreds of years in persecution. I'm sure everybody knows that during those recusant years, the only way that Catholics could access the sacraments was in the houses of the gentry. So because that's where one could hide a priest and say the Mass relatively unseen. So for something that has always been the faith of the ordinary, and in fact, in this country, often the faith of the poor, these years had a strangely aristocratic quality to them, which didn't mean that ordinary people weren't maintaining their observance. It just meant that they had to do it within the houses of the gentry. So the houses of the gentry became the kind of protected grounds. And even though that meant breaking the law, it nonetheless also enculturated this sense in aristocratic families that they towed the line really firmly in order to protect their children. So we find this very kind of law-abiding, quite cowed aristocratic world off in the countryside with horses and often a monk. There was always the chapel and the monk or the priest drifting in because the sacrament structured the day completely. This was basically a monastic life within the aristocratic house. So with this novel, One Poor Scruple, that's what the older generation, that's the code they live by. But we're on the cusp of a new century, and the next generation aren't interested. I mean, they are, but they're curious now. It's legal to be a Catholic. One can legally go to a university. But oddly, this opportunity was not taken up as quickly as one might think. And in fact, a number of the first few kind of established or legal Catholic cardinals after the reestablishment of the hierarchy didn't want Catholic children to go to Oxford and Cambridge because they thought that they would be contaminated in what was still seen really as the training ground for Anglican clergy. So it was still very much a Protestant education, and families were suspicious of their children going. And that's created a really difficult generational conflict of young Catholics who wanted to be in the world and to be part of its fruitfulness, especially literary-minded Catholic young people who wanted to get into London, and parents who didn't know how much freedom to give them, and whether it was in their gift anyway to give it or take it away. So we see the younger generation do arrive in London and have to navigate the moral problems of a actually really quite dissolute, fashionable London society. And it's depicted brilliantly. And it's really a very, very moving novel, because the younger generation do have to make great sacrifices. But we see their hunger for learning, and their hunger for love, and their hunger for the world, and all the excitement that's there. And we see them having to work out where the good is in that, and where there are points that we should actually just not step across, and the goodness in not stepping across once we've located where that line is. So that, I would say, that is the main novel that knows about its recusant past. As soon as we get into the new century, to be honest, every novel that we read has forgotten about that past. I think it was probably so traumatic, they just put it behind them and started to engage with the immediate questions of now, which was often war, and much more immediate 20th century problems. What would you say, Julia?
Yeah, I just add to that I think that novel is a great example of how a lot of these novels are very much rooted in their time in history, and yet are so relevant to today, because obviously I'm sure everyone's thinking this as we hear Bonnie speak about this, we're dealing with that very much today, this question of the extent to which to hunker down and shield ourselves off from a world that isn't really favorably inclined towards our faith, and to what extent to nonetheless join that world, because obviously that's what, as human beings, we just have a desire to do. We want to pursue our interests and live life to the full, and of course we are also called to carry the faith into that world. And so again, a lot of the questions that Ward engages in that novel are just so topical to today and so relevant still. And Houselander's The Dry Wood is that in a similar way. So in a sense, it's written right after the Second World War, and so it centers on the question of suffering, which Houselander wrote a lot about in her nonfiction as well, in her spiritual writings, because, like I said, she worked a lot with people who were traumatized from the war, or who had various forms of neuroses for whatever reason, and with orphan children and so on. And in this novel, I think she kind of distills all that suffering that she has encountered in the world, and that she's so acutely attuned to, into this particular case of an innocent child suffering from, the disability he has, and of the whole community suffering with the child, and of everyone in that community carrying their own baggage. And so again, while that novel comes out of the Second World War and is situated in an East London Docklands parish that is just, ravaged by poverty and various forms of dissolution and affliction, nonetheless, you can just as well transpose it into our age today, and where, in Houselander's post-war years, perhaps it was particularly neuroses that were afflicting people. Now it might be just that sort of spiritual emptiness, and that, a different kind of disaffiliation from God, or a different kind of loneliness, you might say. So every age has its own form of affliction. I think Houselander would agree with that right away. And so that's the beauty of having a Catholic novel, is because it is ultimately, it addresses these historical questions through the lens of the faith, which, you know, comes at it from a kind of timeless perspective, these novels actually manage to remain really topical and relevant and timeless in themselves.
Yeah, I would just echo that. That's right. The Doctrine, the engagement with Doctrine makes these timeless stories, and something about the timelessness means that as Catholic readers, we are immediately connected to the personal reality being depicted, which I find actually makes the particularities of the historical moment even more interesting, because you've already got a kind of landing place at the novel. And then it's like you get to see your own struggles tested out in a different historical moment. The Houselander novel, we get to see what pre-Vatican II London parish life was like, you know, and all the mad people and the way that the parish was run and all of these kind of, I love seeing something from another moment in time that we'll never see. So I love that kind of particularity, but it's particularly pleasing for me because actually, I've already invested in the timelessness, that this is a story about human beings trying to work out how to live through a very human reality when all they have with them is the knowledge of the faith to help them answer those human questions. And that's the meat of the fictional problem in each novel, but we get to see that in these unique settings. I mean, yeah, how great to be in 1980s literary Camden. That'll never come back again, you know, but we get to be there as a Catholic walking the streets.
Directly pursuing that line of thought about how doctrine drives the themes of so many of these novels, Elizabeth Hansen asks that she wonders immediately what that would look like today and if it would work in fiction. Are these writers taking for granted the truth of the doctrines in the substrate of their writing? And are they taking for granted that their readers believe them, that their readers don't believe them? What kind of audience are they speaking to?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Taking for granted maybe sounds a little flippant, but I would say they are, you know, women of faith, generally speaking, and of Orthodox faith at that. Though, of course, you know, everyone is. They're still writing as individuals, and you know, you can't see a writer's soul bed on every page. That's not the point. Sorry, what was the second part of your question? Are they taking that for granted? And
right, in terms of their audience, are they taking for granted that their audience consists more of fellow Catholics? Or are they taking for granted that their audience consists of
sorry. I needed to be reminded. Yeah, to that I would just point out primarily that another thing that is really nice about these novels is that the characters in them are really varied, and so that already shows the extent to which these writers themselves really dealt with and congregated with people of very different backgrounds, like different class backgrounds, different economic backgrounds, but also different backgrounds. Yeah. So there are, in every of these novels, there's an agnostic, and everyone, but you know what I'm saying? Like there's agnostics, there's Jews, there's atheists, militant atheists, there's humanists, the whole gamut really. And there's converts, there's a lot of people who are seekers, and so I think that's why like Caryll Houselander said that after all those years of writing nonfiction, spiritual writings, she finally wrote her first novel and then unfortunately died shortly thereafter. So we only have that one novel by her. But she wrote that because she didn't want to preach at her fellow human beings anymore, but she wanted to walk with them. And this is truly what she does in that novel. And in fact, I think in much of her spiritual writing too. But and what a lot of these women do, that they're really not preachy, they're not didactic either at all. In fact, I mean, we've now said that the doctrine sort of drives it on the one hand, yes, but often very implicitly and subtly and indirectly. So they're not pompously doctrinal at all. They really, but they do show, I think, at least if you're attuned to that and want to see it, how the content of the faith isn't irrelevant to its manifestation. That's the bottom, the main point I think we're trying to make, and that it is often on account of knowing something about God or our call as human beings that characters will actually navigate their way through life, that the content of the faith subtly and sometimes even unconsciously informs their way of looking at their lives, their way of assessing their lives, and the choices they make, and that is not irrelevant. And I think that, that's a point well made. I mean, it's almost incontestable. We know that whatever it is we believe, does somehow shape how we look at things. But it's a point that's perhaps gotten a little lost in the church in recent decades, or at least that has been relativized. But again, not to generalize too much, they each take a different approach. So, yeah.
So, yeah, I would just say that, when we read the Evil and War or Graham Greene, obviously these are novels that had a very, very wide readership and are able to speak to people who don't understand Catholicism at all, but then and enjoyed, hugely enjoyed by people who really don't understand Catholicism. So and I think that's important, that this is literature. That's the thing about literature. It has this human relevance. But then when you read it as a Catholic, of course, you see this extra thing. Now, that sort of suggests that we've got some special key that unlocks the true meaning, but I don't necessarily think that's true either. I think we've all experienced picking up our favorite novels, whether they're Catholic or not, a decade later and a decade later, and we always see something new, because the whole point of good literature is to be like a fire that keeps giving off sparks, and every time we read it, we'll see something new, and that's why we have to keep reading. But there is that element in these novels, and this is one of the things that Julia and I have as our reason for choosing which ones we're bringing back into press. Are they novels that will appeal broadly, but which also have this element that is clearly enough Catholic that it has some that is part of the puzzle that we can draw out. So someone in the chat, I think, mentioned Rumer Godden's novels in this House of Breed. I love her novels. They're wonderful. Mostly they're with Virago. And so we won't have any of hers for the time being. But some of her novels are obviously, they're set within a women's religious house. And everything that structures the drama of the novel is drawn from the faith. But that it's drawn from a version of the faith that most of us don't remember. We didn't live through convent life before Vatican II. So we can't assume a knowledge of the things that the novel seems to assume. And yet the details are woven into the fabric of the fiction such that we learn from it. And I think a good work of fiction, which is, it's very difficult. This is why it's so difficult to write fiction, because the world making needs to make complete sense, but also it can't alienate the reader, and yet at best it can actually provide you with an experience of a world that you don't know about. So it might be that some non-Catholic readers start to sense the Catholic bit of the narrative. The Sheila Kaye-Smith novel that we've been talking about, the Sussex farming novel, The End of the House of Allard, in that we have a whole family. We have basically the last generation of the Allard family. And all of them are having to make decisions about what they're going to do in relation to this burdensome estate and name that's clearly coming to an end. The aristocracy was ending. This is the matter of Evelyn Waugh's novel as well. Obviously, it's this historical moment in Britain when the aristocracy was coming to an end. But her novel looks at what that means for believers. So we get to see all of the four siblings and their relative spouses, if they have them, in this last generation, making decisions about what matters now that the world is changing so much. It's really actually asks really big questions, but only two of those characters are believing, observant Catholics, and their decisions are clearly made on very different grounds to everybody else, but the other characters are not condemned for their decisions. And in fact, in our introduction, we talk a lot about natural love and divine love in that novel, because there's still a good in the natural love. It's just that we can see that those lives who aren't able to orientate their natural love towards the divine suffer in ways. I mean, they all suffer in some ways, but for some of them, that suffering has an additional fruit, and for others, it doesn't. So all of the world is depicted in these novels, but there is often that extra little bit that we can get from it.
So given the enduring concerns of these novels, their timeless quality, their illumination of the life of faith, Sarah Sampaio asks, what are some of the possible reasons why these authors have disappeared from historical records and from publishing catalogs? And then as a second part to that, Fritz Heinzen asks, how difficult has it been to secure the rights to some of these? I imagine that's a whole journey.
Indeed.
Yeah,
There's a Bonnie anymore. You go, Bonnie.
We've worked for a lot of hours over many years on this project. We're with a university press, so everything needs to be completely above board. And it's a small press, and obviously making the case for a Catholic series to rights holders is not always an easy sell. So we have a whole portfolio of titles that we would like, and we're steadily working away at all of them. We have, of all of those that are not in public domain, we have secured rights and access, and there's a lot more that we're chipping away at. And I have a vision of us as very old ladies at the point when our favorite novels come into public domain, and then we pounce on them with these introductions that we wrote years ago, ready to drop into the world. So it's very labor intensive, and it's really become quite a bit of our lives, right, Julia? I mean, I still am a full-time lecturer at Cambridge. I still teach Shakespeare and all this other stuff completely unrelated to these novels, and we have children to raise as well. But all the time we're working away at these women because we very much feel it's now become our mission too, right?
Yeah.
And it does feel like that. It's laborsome, but it's fun, and we had to learn a lot. We've learned a lot about how to do it, but it's put us in contact with people. And I think actually that's, we're realizing now, we're starting to prepare our 5th title, and we're realizing the fruits of walking with these people, the dead people and the people who are still alive, meeting the people who knew them and finding out about them. It's been terrific. Our 4th title that we've prepared earlier this year is the complete short stories of a woman called Enid Dinnis. I don't know if anyone knows about her. She was a London writer who lived this very hidden life. Some of her short stories used to feature in American periodicals like The Star, The American Catholic, Ave Maria, periodicals which, when they are written about by literary historians, are completely maligned, I would say, as pulp fiction, which I find kind of shocking. It's true that some of these are really very pious tales that were written specifically for Catholic families to support them in late 19th century America, where they're often living in a rural environment and don't have much access to other Catholics. So these were stories that were designed to help sustain them in the faith. But they are kind of they're pious tales that are sort of pitched to a less educated readership, we might say, but that doesn't make them that doesn't mean they deserve the reputation that they seem to have received from the few people who've written about them. And that's an enormous historical project that needs to be done because none of those titles are digitized. They're all there in the libraries here and in the States. But in amongst those stories were stories by Enid Dinnis, who writes little fairy, she calls them God's fairy tales. And they're very grounded in doctrine, but they have this sort of the tone of the fairy tale, which is on the surface sort of simple, possibly innocent or childlike, but actually quite sophisticated in the depth in which they engage with doctrine. So we were just preparing the introduction and reading about her because she did have this very hidden life. It took a lot of archival digging. I had to meet the religious sisters that she lived with in secret. And then we had to find out where she lived. It turns out she lived down the road, all these connections that we felt we were walking with the women. So it's actually been a real gift to discover what history has lost, because we feel very close to the writers. Would you say, Julia, that's been one of the
definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they would have, a lot of them would have read texts that we're still reading today, or there's just so many links. Absolutely.
I think we have time for one more brief question, and I'll take one from Angela O'Donnell, who asks, is there a parallel among Catholic women poets? Do we have forgotten Catholic women poets who might crop up? If so, who would they be? Obviously, Houselander wrote some poetry. I think of Edith Sitwell. I don't know if you have thought about including women poets in the series, or if that's something you have an interest in. Could you speak to that?
Elizabeth Jennings. Is anyone out there reading Elizabeth Jennings? She only died recently. She wrote volumes and volumes and volumes of amazing Catholic poetry. She actually wrote it to pay her bills. Amazing. You would ever do that with poetry.
Yeah. And speaking of paying of bills, I think the issue is to persuade CUA Press to actually do poetry as well, because for them, this is the first time they've ever done fiction. So it's anyhow a little experimental on their end, but they're really supportive and enthusiastic. But poetry is probably a step further still in terms of economic risk taking. So we'll see, but they're certainly on our radar and on our list. People like Edith Sitwell, exactly. And Bonnie, you can probably speak to that more.
And Elizabeth Jennings, Alice Meynell. There's a lot of poets and essayists who were friends with our novelists, and who everybody knew each other.
It's actually interesting that a lot of them, sorry to interrupt, but a lot of them wrote novels, poetry, and essays or nonfiction. So there's no clear division, like because you just mentioned Alice Meynell, same for Caryll Houselander. Yeah, so it's great to see that there is such overlap. Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
What the other thing I say is in the literary critical, like academic world, there tends to be more interest in poetry from writers of faith. So a lot of the Catholic writers that are not necessarily in print for a broader readership are known by my colleagues. I find that odd, actually. I just think poetry is a bit more like it's already considered niche. So you have a Catholic poet. Well, that's okay. Poets are already niche, but when it's a Catholic novelist, I don't know. I get a different kind of reaction. I have to fight a bit harder for the novelists, even though that's what most people actually want to read. So I do think we could do an anthology of poetry, but I would also say that I think that's kind of happening. I've got colleagues who are not Catholic at all who are someone's bringing out a full edition of Alice Meynell's essays. I was like, why, she's ours anyway. But so she's becoming popular in a broader, non-Catholic readership. So there's definitely writing of all sorts and also we haven't mentioned some of the American writers that we're looking at, and Irish, Scottish, Welsh writers. And in fact, we're looking at titles that need to be translated into English. So it is a very big project. But we kind of, for each novel, we're giving it the fullness of care. We spend a lot of time on the covers and the make of the book, and the introductions take a lot of thought. We write those collaboratively. And so we, each one kind of has its own sort of life. It's a real kind of work of a gift, I suppose. But once we've gone through our kind of, the first pile, I think there will be a lot more diverse kinds of literature coming out. Yeah.
Just to maybe briefly, if I may, return to your question about why they fell away from our historical memory. Again, Bonnie would have more to say, like on everything. But we don't ultimately know, I suppose. We can't know. Sure, you could argue that gender is part of it, and maybe to some extent it is more likely almost. I think it's just commercial changes in the publishing world. A lot of the Catholic publishing houses fell, or really struggled and eventually were bought up in the second half of the 20th century. And with that went a lot of religious and theological writing, including, unfortunately, some fiction. Also, though, and this is perhaps something that's more interesting to us, there is an argument to be made that a lot of these writers, precisely on account of being really so beautifully balanced and well-rounded, actually didn't really fit into either camp that you found after the Second World War in the second half of the 20th century. So as we all know, after the Second Vatican Council, I should have said, sorry. So as we all know, there has been, unfortunately, a polarization within the church as within wider society, but certainly in the church as well, and a divide between different camps. And a lot of doctrinal and other theological devotional points, etc., have been dissected and, you know, attached to one camp or another. And the writers we're so into and looking at they actually unite those differences. So, for example, they will be, all of them, incredibly generous and charitable towards each of their characters, no matter what their beliefs, etc. But at the same time, they will be unashamed about the reality of human sinfulness and will really address that. Like we said, they are really attuned to the importance and relevance of doctrine and, in some sense or other, of orthodoxy. And at the same time, they are not all, but a lot of them have a very mystical mindset and are very focused on the primary reality of the faith being love, which in a sense, you know, completely transcends and at the same time underpins doctrine and you know, puts that in its place in terms of its centrality to the faith. And the list goes on. You know, a lot of them are really focused on, like we said, the need to alleviate poverty, and in that sense on sort of social work, and at the same time they are willing to actually explore poverty and other forms of hardship for their spiritual meaning. They are very interested in all sorts of Catholic devotions, and will, you know, use these as a dramatic means for their story. And at the same time, they're really intellectual, or at least sort of intellectually profound as well, and so on. So maybe people didn't know how to make sense of them, and therefore they were harder to market along certain one-dimensional and clear-cut lines. And that might be one important reason why in the end nobody quite knew what to do with them, and they were let go.
Yeah, so if you think about someone like David Lodge, he's the main kind of modern British novelist that was regularly in print after the Vatican Council. But he's really the novelist who charts the total disaffiliation of his generation. It's quite, you know, each of his novels is further disaffiliated from the faith. And I think that's the kind of Catholic novel that was publishable at the time, because it was less and less Catholic as the century wore on. But in fact, one of the interesting things that we found in looking at women is that they are often, I'm particularly interested at the moment in a cluster of women that were writing at the end of the 20th century who were very postmodern. Alice Thomas Ellis, and she was, of course, very inspired by Muriel Spark, who is in print, but no one ever writes about Spark's Catholicism. But in fact, that kind of writing is actually deeply Catholic once you've got an eye for it. But it's very postmodern as well, and it's quite a unique vision there, because those were two quite. They were, on the one hand, in a literary sense, very sophisticated and witty, very clever. But on the other hand, they were actually traditionalist Catholics who just had it with whatever was going on in modernity. And they somehow brought those two together to craft these novels that most readers probably wouldn't even notice that they're Catholic. But if you follow a certain structural argument in the postmodernity of the narrative, there's this very Catholic vision that's quite clever. So I think that at any given moment, there is something to be found in the novels, but I think for most of them, there is a reason. For most of them, we can point to a reason and think, I think that's why it fell out of print. But there are different reasons. I would say with the Josephine Ward, because of the time when she was writing, for her, it's probably a clear-cut case of it being her gender. If any man of her status at that time of history who knew Newman and who wrote 10 novels and did all these things probably would have stayed in print, but lots of male novelists from the time did fall out of print. But with all of the others, I'm not sure that gender's necessarily a factor. It might just be the kind of woman, the literary canon that I teach changed radically after feminism, and that seriously changed the kinds of women novelists that people wanted to read. And these women wouldn't really have made the cut, as it were, in the literary circles then, in the academic reading lists then. But as Julia says, they maybe weren't necessarily the kinds of Catholics that the turbulent and changing church in those last decades of the 20th century wanted either. So we're just really glad to be finding them now.
It's wonderful to have had this conversation with you and to realize with so many attendees here today that the audience for this type of novel and for these novels is opening up. It reminds me of something that novelist Christopher Bay has said at the most recent Catholic Imagination Conference, which is that one of the cultural issues we face is not so much that the Catholic imagination is devalued, but that all imagination has become culturally devalued. But wherever people still value imaginative qualities, they still value the Catholic imagination. And certainly it seems that wherever the Catholic imagination is valued, women's Catholic imagination will also be of great value. So thank you so much. I just wanted to share very quickly before the end, one of our commenters didn't have a question, but just wanted to let us know that they are the great nieces of Caryll Houselander who are watching from London, which is amazing. And before we let everyone go, as I see,
can you write? Sorry, Katie. Can I just say, can you write to me? My email's all over the Cambridge University website. It would be wonderful to hear from you.
Yeah, definitely. We'd love to meet you. That's amazing.
That's wonderful, yeah. And before I let you go, as we're at time, I wanted to let everybody know that the Collegium Institute's Global Catholic Literature series will feature Caryll Houslander's The Dry Wood as our book pick for the spring. That'll be Mondays in March. There's a link that's going to go into the chat so that everybody can take a look at that. And there is a registration discount code that also should go into the chat. It is, forgive me, I believe it's Lost Women 15. I'm going to look that up.
It is. It's
okay, wonderful. And that's good through February 10th. Again, thank you all so much for your time. And Bonnie and Julia for this conversation.
Sorry to interrupt. To interrupt.
Not at all.
If Emmy's there, can we just put up that slide with the front covers so people can see the 3 novels that are out now? Is that
that's a great idea?
Thanks, Emmy.
Okay. All right, beautiful. Well, thank you all so much again for coming out. We are very grateful and really looking forward to digging deeper into Houslander's text with you in March.
Thanks so much, Katie and Jessica. It was great to meet you all. And thanks for all your questions. Really good questions. Bye.
Great questions.